right, so we're going to keep rolling with Unit 6 here in the second wave of feminism, and we're going to be getting into the 1970s now. So starting in 1970, women took a couple of really big steps, and we're going to see the 70s really have a lot more action than the 1960s even did when it comes to the women's liberation movement. You know, the 1960s, there definitely was some change and there definitely was some progress, but a lot of it was about consciousness raising. It was about discussing the issues, and we saw a lot of publications come out and a lot of groups forming. And in the 1970s, it's more about those groups like taking action, staging protests, and things like that. So in 1970, a group of women put together a textbook about women's bodies called Our Bodies, Ourselves. And this is a conversation that started to happen all over the country, but it was much more of a national discussion when the birth control hearings started to happen, and they started to discuss really the negative side effects of birth control and how a lot of those conversations hadn't been had with women. And we definitely see a racial disparity even in medicine among women when we see not necessarily, am I talking about women working, I'm talking about patients, you know. So many women are taught to that, you know, they're over emotional, and there's this you know, we see a lot of women have their symptoms not taken as seriously by doctors, and a lot of women aren't taught about their own anatomy, so they don't even know what's going on. You know, there was no courses in college or high school that discussed women, not women's literature, not women's art, not women's history, not women's biology, none of it. When there was a class that, you know, that discussed anatomy, it was pretty much just about male anatomy. Female anatomy was to a minimum. And and especially when you're talking about people taught not to take your symptoms seriously, women of color are at much higher rates of that than even white women. So there was a group of women who got together and decided to basically investigate all this for themselves and publish their own medical book to teach women about their own bodies. They decided to do this after being at a health seminar that was hosted by a woman at Emmanuel College in Boston. And these women got together and formed a group called the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, and they wrote this book. And what they decided was, you know, that they were having conversations, and they realized that they knew so little about their own bodies. They knew so little about the medical sides of so many women's issues. They knew so little about hormones and abortions and pregnancy and depression and postpartum depression. And they knew so little about menstruation and all these other things. So they decided to sit down, investigate all this stuff, talk to some women doctors, and write it all down for women to be able to know. So each woman in the group took a different part, one that they were familiar with. So like, you know, a mom might write about pregnancy or postpartum depression or something. And they published the book in 1970. It originally sold 250,000 copies with zero advertising. They did not advertise this book at all, but it was a book that women wanted. This is something that people really felt was necessary. And since then, they've published newer editions. And now, you know, to this day, they've sold over 4 million copies. And it's considered one of the like founding moments in the women's health movement in the United States, which is pretty impressive. The book is still around in its newest edition. I'm not sure what edition they're up to at this point. It's definitely more than 35 cents, so don't let the that title page fool you. Other things that happened in 1970, a really big one is going to be women in sports. This is going to be a huge year for women's education, and we'll see women in sports get a new opportunity out of this. Now, as I mentioned, women were realizing and learning that when they went to college, they graduated with pretty much with all this knowledge, but zero knowledge about women. All of the major historical figures and all of the artists and all of the writers and all of the scientists that they had been talked about to and had learned about were all men, and they had very little knowledge of women. And on top of that, women in the academic setting were treated so much differently than men were. And ladies, when you go to college, this is something that you'll definitely experience at least once. It's inevitable. I definitely experienced it several times in college because I was in a department that was primarily male. History departments are almost always dominated by men. There's really only 3 or 4 girls in my department across, several different classes. So I had quite a few classes where I was the only girl, and I saw this several times. And it really just comes down to the conversation takes place without you having to be involved. A lot of what happens is people, they don't expect the girl to contribute to what's being said in the room. They don't expect for her to have anything to say. And when she does have something to say, it's just not taken seriously. Or if she does say something with intelligence, it's definitely a shock. So we'll start to have more conversations about women's equality in education. And in 1970, the federal government's going to pass Title IX. Title IX, if you don't know, guarantees equality in education that is federally funded. So, you have to, it primarily affects, public schools and colleges, and it's basically requiring that they all treat their students equally. Now, there's a lot of ways this has shaken out that they didn't expect it to shake out. And the first is women's sports. We definitely know that women's sports and women in any type of sport has been, a long road. Just 3 years before this, in 1967, a woman tried to run the Boston Marathon. Women were not allowed to run in the Boston Marathon at that point in time. And her name was Catherine Switzer. And she signed up to run the Boston Marathon under her initials. And instead of putting Catherine, she just put her first initial K and then whatever her middle initial was. And when she went to pick up her number that morning, her boyfriend picked it up for her. And when she put her number on and people started to realize that she had registered for the race and she was going to run, the guy who was in charge of the race actually tried to rip it off of her. And when they began the race, he tried to tackle her, and her boyfriend had to tackle him to the ground to prevent this woman from just running in a marathon. It's not like she was going to get paid to do any of this. You don't get paid to run in the Boston Marathon. If anything, you pay to run in the Boston Marathon. But he was clearly losing his mind at the thought of a woman running in this race. Ultimately, she was able to finish the marathon, which was amazing. And finally, in 1972, the Boston Marathon legally allowed women to join the race for the first time. But, Catherine Switzer's experience was far from abnormal. And so, especially when we were looking at women in college athletic programs, a lot of men were able to rely on athletics as a way to pay for their college. And a lot of women didn't have necessarily that opportunity because there wasn't nearly as much money put into women's athletics as there was into men's. And there still isn't quite an equality there. There's certainly a disparity, but is far less than it has ever been. So, and that's not what Title VII was designed to do. They weren't really thinking about women's sports when they wrote this. They were thinking about wanting to make sure that women had an equal access to education in the classroom. But the way that women were able to use this was to get them equality in sports. And it opens up a whole new type of conversation. And to this day, that's probably the most common way that Title IX is brought into the discussion, is in regards to sports. Essentially, if you are a female and you want to play a sport, there has to be a team for you. Whether you're allowed on the boys' team or whether there are enough girls to create a women's league, either way, you have to be allowed to play. You can't be told that you're not allowed to play just because you're a woman. And one of the icons of women's sports in the 1970s is going to be the tennis player Billie Jean King. She actually took on, in the 1970s, tennis legend Bobby Riggs, and they labeled it as the Battle of the Sexes. And it was definitely a publicity stunt for Bobby, who didn't really even train for the match, because he thought it would be a joke and that it would be cake to beat Billie Jean King. And he spouted a lot of misogynist vocabulary and had plenty of negative things to say about women. And but Billie Jean King took it very seriously, and she trained. And when it came time for the match, she whipped his butt. And not necessarily, no one's saying that women are better than men at tennis, and I don't think that anyone thought that at the time, but it was definitely a whole new conversation to say that at a minimum, this woman here was good enough to beat this man, who is considered to be one of the greatest tennis players of all time. And it definitely highlighted so much. It was a huge point for Billie Jean King's career, and gave her an opportunity to, down the line, actually come out of the closet and come out as a gay woman in sports, which is a whole other issue. As the other ways that we're starting to see Title IX come up now is rape on college campuses. There are currently dozens and dozens and dozens of Title IX cases pending across the country, at colleges all over the United States. Pretty much every major university probably right now has a Title IX case pending against them regarding rape on college campuses. And it's a lot of victims of sexual assault on college campuses whose cases were not handled correctly by college administration, by university administration. A lot of times, this has happened so many times where a woman has come forward as a victim of sexual assault on a college campus, and the university isn't, law enforcement, and they have to conduct their own investigation, which they're not exactly entirely equipped to do because, like I said, they're not law enforcement. And a lot of times they will, sometimes out of, a feeling like they don't have enough evidence, and sometimes out of the goal to keep their own rape and sexual assault statistics low at their school, will try to brush a lot of it under the rug, and instead will suggest that the girl, rearrange her schedule to avoid him, maybe move dorms to avoid him, something like that. And a lot of these women have come forward to say, like, that's not equal. Like, why do I have to disrupt my life when he has already done that by assaulting me? He should not be able to, go on about his education normally when mine has to be completely disrupted. So lots of women have come together and used Title IX to now file cases against universities in how they handle sexual assault cases on their campuses. So we'll see how that plays out and how the court system is able to interpret a lot of that. So moving on through the 1970s, two major cases that we're going to see come back to back, 1972 and 1973. The first, in 1972, Eisenstadt v. Baird, the Supreme Court officially ruled that access to oral contraceptives and birth control be available to all women, not just married women, not just married middle class women or upper class women, but all women across the country. So this is a big moment for women's liberation, was the free access to oral contraceptives and birth control. And then in 1973, Roe v. Wade, the decision came. And if you're not familiar, if you don't remember Roe v. Wade from American history, the Supreme Court decided on a woman's right to choose in that case. So essentially the background of the case was that every state at the time had different laws regarding abortion, and some states granted a woman her right to choose, some states didn't, some states only granted it within a certain number, the first maybe few weeks. Every state did it differently, and there was a woman who got pregnant, wanted to get an abortion, but couldn't in her state, and did not have the money to travel to a different state. By the time she was able to do that in a different state, it was already too late into her pregnancy for her to have an abortion. So she filed a claim, and it wasn't just her, it was several different cases lumped together. Rose was just the first name. That wasn't her real name. They did use a pseudonym for her to keep some anonymity. Since then, I do believe she's come out and announced her identity, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. But nevertheless, the Supreme Court decided to essentially break up a woman's right to choose into 3 categories through your 3 trimesters. First trimester, guaranteed right to choose. Second trimester, it's up to the state in a lot of cases. Third trimester is typically only in cases of medical emergency. So if the mother's life is being threatened, and if she would like to choose to terminate the pregnancy and try again later or something, then that's an option for her in most states. Since then, more recently we've seen a lot of states trying to restrict abortion rights, and that of course being a violation of the case Roe v. Wade. So we've seen a lot of those cases been getting appealed by the ACLU to the federal level, and I think a lot of those states are hoping to lose those cases at lower levels so that they can make it to the federal level and make it to the Supreme Court once again and try and overturn the case Roe v. Wade. And we'll have to see how all that shakes out. Some other protests that are important to note through the 1970s was the Women's Strike for Equality, organized by Betty Friedan and the Women of Now. Tens of thousands of women across the country decided to strike. It was sort of like a day without women. One of the slogans was "Don't iron while the strike is hot." So so they had this huge parade, and they were trying to encourage not only women in the workplace, but women at home, all types of women, to strike for a day and to let sort of like the rest of society see how much women contribute. They had this huge parade. Women, had this big typewriter, and some women chained themselves to this big fake typewriter to talk about the job opportunities available to women in the private sector and things like that. So that was a huge protest moment. And the other was Take Back the Night. So the Take Back the Night protests began in Philadelphia, actually, protesting the death of a woman named Susan Spieth, who on her way home from work one night was attacked and stabbed to death. And so her friends got together and decided to stage this protest called Take Back the Night, to have conversations about violence against women. And that's not something that the mainstream liberal feminist movement talked about too much, was about violence against women. It's definitely not something that the conservative side of the conservative feminists really discussed. And it's starting to become more and more of a mainstream conversation towards these later years of the second wave about violence against women and how women should be able to walk home from work at night and not have to worry for their physical safety the way that most men are able to walk alone at night and not have to worry for their physical safety, at least not to the extent that women do. But definitely the biggest fight and the biggest battle all through the 1970s that the women's movement is going to have is for the Equal Rights Amendment. The women's liberation movement had been working on getting an ERA passed since Alice Paul wrote the first copy after the 19th Amendment was passed. And all the Equal Rights Amendment does is establish equality between men and women, and it would continue to eliminate a lot of those disparities that we not only see at work, but in education, in healthcare, every type of disparity. This would help to eliminate those, or it will at least give women a foothold to be able to stand on when they take up a lot of these issues in a court setting. So a movement was primarily led by a lot of different women, but one of the faces of the movement that we're going to see for the ERA is Gloria Steinem, the same woman who wrote the Playboy Bunny expose. She was a huge face of the movement and really, really famous woman, and still works to this day for changes similar to the ERA, if not the ERA itself. But Gloria Steinem, she went before Congress and testified about all of the things that the ERA would do and why it was necessary, and that gave her a huge platform, and a lot of women saw her as like this icon and sort of leading the fight for the ERA. But it wasn't, but of course Gloria Steinem has to have some opposition, and one of the most, if not the most, vocal opponents to the ERA was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, and that's her there on the slide with the Stop ERA sign on her chest there. Phyllis and a lot of the other women and men who were opposed to the ERA, a lot of their arguments were the same arguments that were used to oppose women's suffrage. Was about all the negative things it would do. It would force women to be drafted, and it would do all of these other crazy things. Women would be required to make as much money as their husband, and it would put too much of a burden on women, and it would do all these damaging things to the family. It would ruin the American family and all of this other stuff. Ultimately, the ERA did pass Congress, but it was not able to get ratification in time by the states because it was one state short. Since then, the ERA has been written several times and has made it to a vote, but it has never gotten as much support as it was able to get there in the 1970s. So we'll see if we ever get to a moment in time where it's able to get enough votes to actually pass, but in the meantime, it's not something that we're seeing.